Hey guys, how's it going? Today I wanted to make a card using multiple media. I'll start off today with the alcohol ink portion of the card with some Yupo paper and a variety of alcohol inks. All of the alcohol inks that I'm using today are from Tim Holtz line. And I chose to create this element first because it needs time to dry before I can die cut my element. I'll start up today with some Mermaid alcohol ink, and I'm just going ahead and dripping the alcohol ink randomly onto the paper. Next, I'll come in with some Stream alcohol ink, some Boysenberry alcohol ink, some Vineyard alcohol ink, and then I'll come in with a blower to move those alcohol inks around a little bit, making sure that they cover as much of the Yupo paper as possible because I want to utilize as much of the Yupo paper as possible for die cutting and without creating a lot of waste. I'll come in next with some Cobalt, followed by some Monsoon. I'll then add a little bit of silver alloy, and I want to make sure that the silver is really shaken up really nicely before adding it to the Yupo paper. I'll then come in with some blending solution, and using my alcohol ink blower, I'll move those alcohol inks around the Yupo paper. And I chose these colors today because I know what colors I'll be incorporating into my card front. And I want this alcohol ink element to tie in nicely with the card front of my card. I decided to add just a little bit more blending solution to my Yupo paper, followed by some pistachio alcohol ink. I really debated the addition of this color. In the end, I'm really glad that I did. It really ties in this alcohol ink element with the rest of my background. I had this idea for a card over a year ago and it has evolved so much since that initial idea. I finally have all the products that I need, and I gotta tell you, it turned out better than I ever could have imagined a year ago. Off camera, I made sure that the alcohol ink covered the entire portion of the Yupo paper, and once I was happy with that, I'll just set it aside to dry. I'll move on now to the rest of my card front, starting with a piece of 110-pound white cardstock and my stamping tool. I have a Stamp Perfect stamping tool, but any stamping tool that you have will work just fine. I'll start off by preparing my cardstock for embossing by removing any of the debris with a dedicated paintbrush, as well as a dryer sheet to eliminate any static. Alternatively, you could also use a anti-static powder tool for this step. So I want the entire card front to be text, and today I'm using Simon Says Stamp You Matter Background Cling Stamp. And after I've prepared that cardstock for embossing, I'll place the background stamp onto my cardstock just to make sure that it's going to stamp to both sides of my cardstock. I did notice, however, that the lines of text weren't square with the stamp itself. So after I've made sure that the text will reach both sides of the cardstock, I went ahead and lined up the line of text with a guideline on the door of my stamping tool. And with the piece of cardstock square in the stamping tool and the line of text lined up straight with a guideline on the door of the stamping tool, the text should stamp fairly straight. Once I'm happy with the placement of the stamp, I'll go ahead and press the stamp to the door of the stamping tool. So my stamping tool doesn't come with sheets designed to protect the entire stamping surface, so I chose just to place a piece of scrap paper behind my cardstock. I'll then come in with some Versamark ink and ink up my stamp, making sure to work methodically, however that works for you, just to cover the entire stamp. Then I'll go ahead and close that over and press it down. I wanted to make sure that the Versamark ink was evenly stamped across the entire cardstock, so I went ahead and inked up the stamp again before closing it over. So the embossing product that I'll be using today is Distress Embossing Glaze, and today I have Cracked Pistachio, Wilted Violet, Broken China, and Salvaged Patina. And this is the first time that I've ever worked with these products, and I want to make sure that I don't use more of the product than I have to, or I don't accidentally spill more onto the page. So I chose to dump a little bit of the product into the lid and then scatter it onto the page fairly randomly, because I know that I'm going to be mixing these colors together and I won't be able to return them to the jar. Admittedly, I did struggle with this product a little bit. I have used embossing powders in the past, and I found that it was challenging to get the powder to set. What changed it for me was I changed the embossing ink that I used. So if you're having a challenge with this product, try a different embossing ink if you have one on hand. And to move the embossing glazes around, I went ahead and picked up the cardstock and from the back tapped the cardstock to not only spread the embossing glaze over the entire card front, but also to mix those colors together. Once the entire stamped portion is covered with embossing glaze, I'll go ahead and tap off the excess embossing glaze. And using a heat tool, working methodically, I set the powder moving left to right, down, and then right to left. Now that the embossing glaze is set, I'll use Simon Says Stamp Basic Rectangles to cut that card front down to size. The rectangle that I chose is 4 by 5 1/4. And before taping that die down, I chose my favorite area of text, and I also tried my best to line up the die as straight as possible. With that rectangle cut out, I'll come in with some Distress Oxide Tumbled Glass and blend the ink over the entire card front. Now that the embossing glaze is set, it creates a resist. So the Distress Oxide ink will not be taken in by the areas of text that have been embossed and set, but the ink will absorb into the paper that has not been embossed. So Distress embossing glazes are translucent, and they are also true to their color on the package once they're set. So Broken China will set to the color Broken China, even though it doesn't look like Broken China in the jar. With them being translucent though, if they're embossed onto a piece of cardstock that is not white cardstock, the color will be a little bit different because the color of the cardstock or the blended ink background before it's embossed will show through a little bit. Using this combination of embossing glazes as well as a tumble glass, I really like how it creates that tone on tone look in certain areas of the card front, but then in other areas the text pops because it's so different from the background, like with the Wilted Violet or the Cracked Pistachio. Using Simon Says Stamped Etched Butterfly die, this is probably my favorite butterfly die that I currently own. I'll cut out a butterfly from the Yupo paper now that the alcohol inks have dried. And as I set the die down on the Yupo paper, I want to make sure that the die is going to cut out a piece of the paper that incorporates all the colors that I've included in the background of my card front. For the sentiment, I chose to cut the word "you" out of aluminum holographic cardstock using Simon Says Stamp "you" die. For the remaining sentiment, I chose "You Make the World a Better Place" from Simon Says Stamp Clear Stamps You Matter set. Now it's worth noting that the "You" die, the background die, and the "You Matter" stamp set is available as an entire set from Simon Says Stamp, or you can also purchase each of the elements individually. I chose black cardstock for the remainder of my sentiment. So after placing that back into my stamping tool, I'll go ahead and prepare this piece of cardstock for embossing as well. Again, using that dedicated paintbrush to remove any little debris, and then coming in with that dryer sheet to remove any static. I then picked up the stamp using the stamping tool door, making sure that the sentiment is straight with one of the guidelines on the stamping door. And again, I'll use some Versamark ink to ink up that stamp. I'll close the door over and press it down. For this portion of the sentiment, I chose Ranger White Embossing Powder. And I'll add that over a piece of scrap paper so the excess can easily be added back to the jar. And to set that, I'll use my heat tool and trim that sentiment down to size using my paper trimmer. Now that all the elements of the card are complete, I'll go ahead and find the placement of my sentiment first. The nice thing about card fronts that are all text is that it's easy to again find the placement of the sentiments using the lines of text as a reference, and alternatively to using the text on the card front as a reference of where to put the sentiment. The grid lines on the glass mat can also be used, provided that you don't move the card front after you've initially found the placement of your elements. Today I'm using Tombow liquid adhesive, and I added the Tombow liquid adhesive just to a little squeeze bottle that I purchased at my local craft store. I really like these craft bottles for when the die cuts are a little bit more delicate. I'll then go ahead and move the butterfly around to find the placement that I prefer. The thing that I like about this butterfly is it comes in a top half and a bottom half, so I can leave one half of the butterfly on the card front as I add adhesive to the other piece, and then once that is glued down, I can free to add adhesive to the second half. I'm also using Tombow liquid adhesive to adhere the butterfly. And once both halves are adhered down with adhesive, I'll go ahead and set my phone on top just to make sure that the wings of those butterflies don't lift up. I found that the wings did want to lift up a little bit more, especially since the background was embossed and that text was raised just ever so slightly off the surface of the card. I chose a silver cardstock for the body of the butterfly. This silver cardstock is a little bit different than the holographic silver of the U. And again, using the Tombow liquid adhesive in that little craft bottle, I'll adhere the body of the butterfly. And it's okay that a portion of the Y in U is hanging off of the card front, because I want to create a frame out of blue pastel metallic cardstock to bring this card front up to an A2 card size. I chose 2 rectangle dies from Simon Says Stamp Basic Rectangle Dies to create a frame. And as you can see, the center rectangle was not center at all, but that's okay. It was just okay that I could still use this uncentered frame for the mat of my card front. After adding some liquid adhesive to the frame, I added the card front. And once the card front was adhered to the frame, I added everything to an A2 card base. That concludes today's project. Thank you so much for stopping by. We'll see you next time. Bye for now.